So before I begin discussing this topic, I suppose I'll just add a little disclaimer here. I'm not a doctor. I am some schmuck who writes at a keyboard. I do not have medical advice. I do not have any kind of degree. And you should not be looking to me for any sort of advice on the subject. I do not in any way endorse the use of drug use. I am merely speaking my opinion on the topic surrounding drugs in the creative process. Now, with that out of the way, it's undeniable the role that drugs have had on creativity and really on the art itself. And this is across all arts. I think you can go back, at least historical written records, you can go back as far as antiquity and see the role of drugs and how it played a role in like the ancient Greeks, the Romans, etc., in their artwork. I imagine that if you went back as far as the cave paintings, right? You may have had cavemen who were taking, maybe foraging and found psychedelic mushrooms. Who knows? But drugs and the arts have always been interlinked in some way. More so, I think, in certainly decades, more recent decades, just because of the prevalence, the use, the creation of new synthetic ones, what have you. But it's always had a role. It's always played a factor. And so my opinion on it and on them and the role of creativity is a bit strange. I can never deny the effect they have on giving you ideas, on bringing forth creative insights, on sort of replenishing that creative well. That's just, you can look very historically and see that that's played a huge factor. But when it comes to the act of writing, the actual act of creating one's work, to actually sit at the keyboard and type in the case of a writer, I tend to take the Truman Capote mentality, who very famously, very, known for being an alcoholic, but he often would say the act of writing requires such a high level of acuity, you cannot dull any of it with any kind of drug. No alcohol, no drugs, anything. You have to be completely sober to get your best work out there, because you're going to mess with just that thin little balance that your mind's trying to construct to get these perfect sentences and these perfect paragraphs written out. And I very much tend to go with that theory. I never had an experience on any kind of alcohol or any kind of drugs that's ever improved how I write a story. That's actually improved my prose at the time. Even as much as going to just get a couple drinks and coming back to write afterwards, still, not completely sober, but certainly not intoxicated by any means. The prose, even at that level, for me has always been very terrible. And so it's something where I've never really seen any kind of benefit in the use of them in the actual act of creativity. And yet, very paradoxically, the ideas and the insights and the benefits in terms of creativity that one could gain from them, I've never been able to deny either. As I said at the beginning, I've always been very agnostic, very neutral on the subject of drugs in general. I think, not just in the creative sense, but I think just in general, I think some people it's fine and even beneficial perhaps in some ways. For other people, I think it's, detrimental. And it's very much an individualized thing. And yet, it's such a paradox to say that your creativity can go up and yet your skill in getting the creativity out can go down, and finding sort of that balance and the timing and the use of it is always very, very strange. But that's always how I've always approached it. I've always viewed it. I've never seen any kind of benefit in terms of how it improves your work. This is obviously against the trend. This goes against most creative types. I wouldn't say most, but this goes against a very well celebrated group of creative types who have, especially authors who have been very well known alcoholics who have written while drunk, authors who have taken psychedelic drugs and written their prose, authors who have used hard drugs like heroin, for example, and written stories supposedly while under the influence. It's no denying it. There's no denying the role of creativity in drugs and the interconnected nature and how people have managed to pull it off. And yet, for me, and my general opinion on it, is that I've never found it to ever be a benefit. That the actual act of creation, I've never found any sort of drug to be beneficial at all, and that it's often more a detriment to getting my best work out there. So, yeah. That is actually being much shorter than I thought it was going to be. But yeah, just my opinion on the subject. If you got a different one, feel free to share it. But yeah.